Hey everyone, welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting and our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from March 1st, 2024, and I'm recording this on August 30th, 2024. As always, those dates are so you know when this video is actually most relevant because these prices are always moving and changing, as we will see in a minute. Also, as always, we're looking back at the CBSI Hot Top 10 and the Comic Tom Key Collector Hottest Trending Comics of the Week. Why do we do this? So that we make better decisions. We see all these hot books and we're like, oh, I want those, but should we chase them in the moment? Should we be patient? That's what we're trying to figure out. And what are the factors that make books worth chasing in the moment and make you want to be patient? So, we got 18 books to talk about between the two lists this week, so let's see if we can learn anything. First up, we got El Gato Negro, number one, the Amazon series. Basically, there was an Amazon series supposedly in production for this book. Caused people to spend $100 to $200 for this thing. This book was really not worth anything before that. Now, we've only had two recent sales, both all the way back in July, because people are still asking quite a bit for this book. One went for $80, one went for $100. But yeah, this is down in a trap. There's books listed for like $60 that haven't sold, for $60 to $100, and that's basically the range they're listed for right now. They haven't sold. No reason to have chased this book back then, and definitely a trap, borderline getting to dumpster fire because you can't even sell it for less than what the recent sales are. So. Next, we have Neuromancer, number one, another option situation here. We had a bunch of option or just potential option stuff this week. Neuromancer, number one, this was supposedly an Apple TV series was in production, caused us to jump to a $60 to $135 book for a raw copy. A 9.4 went for $375. Still $50 to $75 on recent raw sales, so still better than I would have thought. But a recent 9.4 went for $99. So yeah, from the slabs thing, definitely a dumpster fire. But even from the raw side, we're definitely looking at a trap here. This book is backed up. Still, again, going for more than I would have actually expected, but definitely coming down and not a ton of interest here. Next, we have Resident Alien, number 0. First appearance of the Resident Alien character. Now, this has been a show for a while. There were several seasons done. But it was basically getting a revival at Netflix. That's what caused it to hit the list. But it was still basically a $5 book back then on average. Now it's $5 to $30, so you could actually call this up straight cash, as most of the sales are more like $15, $20. But again, I'm a little surprised this is doing this well. This has been around for a long time, but it is doing okay. All right. The next 3 books are all sort of option news. Basically, Bendis signed an exclusive deal to develop some of his projects for Netflix, and so that is, or not for Amazon, excuse me, looked at the wrong line. With Amazon, we didn't know at that time what series were actually going to be made into anything. I don't know that we still do. So back then, people were just kind of guessing. First up was Pearl, number 1. Basically, people were thinking that might be one that Amazon would do. Raw books back then were going for 10, 9.8 went for 70. This wasn't really up a whole lot from what the book was anyway. Now it's a $5 to $10 book with more sales closer to 5 than to 10. 9.8, $40. So we're still going to call this a trap. But yeah, it's not really going for that much. So if you're interested in Pearl, don't think we've heard any news confirming that this is going to be made into anything. I don't think we've heard any news that any Bendis project is going forward just yet. Next, we had the United States of Murder Incorporated, number 1, another Bendis book, another one just $10. But this has only had one recent sale for $5. So we're going to call this also a trap, as nobody seems to be interested even at the low prices for this one. And then finally, from the Bendis side of things, we had Jinx, number 1 from 1996. Again, was going a bunch of sales around $10, and now there's been no recent sales. So we're going to call all of these traps. No reason to have chased them in the moment. And yeah, basically, cover prices, you can get you these books now. You didn't have to pay anymore. All right, with that, we're going to move into our covers. We got 5 strictly covers and then a few cover/buzz books going through here. First up is Thrawn Alliances. Number 2, the Linnell Francis Yu 1 in 25, which a 1 in 25 going for 35 to 40 is usually not a great sign. But this one is now 15 to 40 with most of the sales kind of in the $30-ish range. But still a couple sales, 35, 40. So we're called this steady and I'll be back. Okay. This one, I got my books confused. There was only like 3 sales here. There was a $15 sale and 2 $40 sales. So it was kind of hard to judge that on a raw side. So we put it steady and I'll be back. But yeah, not a ton of sales going on here. 9.8, 150 to 180. Again, 2 sales. So not a ton of sales here, but still pretty decent value. So we're going to call it steady and I'll be back. But yeah, so it didn't drop as much as I would have thought, but definitely some bargains if you were paying attention. Next, we have Power Girl number 6, the Dan Panosian. I don't know how to pronounce his name. 1 in 25. Again, 40 to 45, which usually indicates a trap, but now it's a $45 to $100 book raw. But interestingly, the only 9.8 sale was also for $100. So there were several sales up around 100 on the raw side. So yeah, we're going to call this up and straight cash because definitely there's some, sales up there close. But there was also some $45 sales. So a little bit of back and forth. A couple sales up around 100, a couple sales down around 45. Not a lot in between. So definitely bargains here. But overall, that's definitely potentially you could have made some money off of this book. All right, next we have Harley Quinn, number 37. This is the Sebastian Fulmer, 1 in 50, 158 to 185 back then. Not sure why it was that specific, but that's what I wrote down. Normally I kind of round a little bit. Now only 1 recent raw sale for 150, but 9.8s of this thing are going for 3 to 400. Again, not a ton of sales there, but 3 sales on 9.8s between 3 and 400. Only the 1 raw sale. So the raw sale is basically just barely below the range it was before, and 9.8s are going for good value. So we're going to call it steady and I'll be back. You could do a little better maybe on the raw side, but you could do pretty well on the 9.8 side if you bought one and slabbed it back then. All right, one last cover strictly. This is Captain Marvel number 5. I think this was actually the 3rd week this was on the list. I think Russell Donnerman 1 in 25. We talked about it last week. It was like $125 to $165 book, and it was basically up from that. By this point, it was $140 to $185 book. And now it's $100 to a $220, although that $220 is a bit of an outlier. So we're going to call this steady and worth it. Because 9.8s are $175 to $250. So yeah, 9.8s aren't that much higher than the raw copies on this particular book. But again, this is one I really liked and I was hoping to get, and continues to go for way more than I want to pay for it. So, all right, our next 3 are all cover/buzz books. Or no, 2 cover/buzz books and then 1 just straight buzz book. First up, we have Wolverine number 36 on the list for 3rd or 4th time in a row. At this point, it was up to a $65 to $75 book. 9.8 for 175, 200, which is basically where that was last week, but on the 9.8s, but the raw copies last week were 45 to 65. Now it's a $50 to $100 book because of that recent series. 9.8s, 150 to 200, so they're right in that same range. You can make a little bit potentially off a raw copy if you'd bought it back then, but yeah, so we're going to call it steady worth it. There's a chance you could have made a little bit, but most likely you're just getting back what you had in it if you bought it and tried to sell it at this point. Next, we have Edge of Spider-Verse, number 1. We had a variant up last week. This week we just had the cover A because it had spider clops and you guys know my feelings about Cyclops. But anyway, raw copies back then, 15 to 25. Now it's a $5 to $10 book. Nobody cares about spider clops. Kind of like nobody cares about Cyclops. But anyway, I'm going to get hate for that. I know. Bring it. I know. I'll get it. Probably deserved. 9.8, 40 to 50. So yeah, this is down in a trap. So yeah, this was like a Spider Wolverine mashup is actually what was doing this, and not the Spider Clops. But there was a couple different Weapon 8, I think is what they were calling this thing, and like that was in this book. But anyway, down in a trap here for this particular cover of this book. Our only true just comic buzz was Ghost Machine #1, the first appearance of Rook, and that was because they basically announced additional Geiger universe books coming, and one of them was Rook was getting his own book, I believe. So 9.8 or raw copies back then were going for $5 whole. I think it was just really a ton of sales. Put this on the list for Tom. Now raw copies are 2 to 10, 9.8 60 to 80, which is kind of pretty bare bones for any kind of first appearance. We'll call it a steady and I'll be back. No reason to buy it back then. You can still basically get it for the same price, but it didn't really drop because it didn't really have anywhere to go, just not as many sales. All right, with that, we're going to get into our MCU books. We only have 2 MCU books this week that back then, which is a pretty low number. First up, we had Sentry #1, the first appearance of Sentry. This was casting rumors, and this was that whole Steven, I can't think of the actor's name yet, but there was rumors that he'd gotten the part, and Robert Kirkman had said something about that he'd gotten the part, and so people were jumping on this. But really, it was like raw copies were going for 80, and they didn't really even talk about 9.8 back then when they were talking about it. And it's like, that's pretty much what this book goes for. Right now, it's a $40 to $100 book for a raw copy, which is pretty much where this has been. 9.8 is $225 to $350. Pretty much where this book has been. We're gonna call this steady and worth it. This is hasn't been a big movement any direction on this book. This is kind of just the range this book sets in. I think we've gotten more casting news recently that's a different actor in terms of Sentry, because we've gotten some more information about Thunderbolts and that kind of thing. So, all right, next we got Fantastic Four #49, first full appearance of Galactus, second appearance of Surfer. So, full disclosure here, like I'd written these values down, and I'm giving you what my predictions were, but I didn't actually do a cash or trash that week. Something came up, I didn't get it done, and the result of that is I didn't go back and fix values here. So all I have written down was the Tom average, which was $4,000, which even they admitted meant nothing, and then the 9.4s and went for 14K and 17K. So I don't have a straight comparison on raw books to talk about. Right now, raw copies are 2 to 600 on this book. I did look across a couple different grades. I'm going to give you 5.0 prices here on the slide of 5 to 600 right now. And basically, this has been pretty steady over the last 6 months, maybe down just a slight tick from this initial news that we were probably going to get a Galactus Silver Surfer story across multiple grades, kind of in that mid-grade range. Probably a slight step back, because this was like a $600-700 book back then in a 5.0, and that's a pretty consistent, like just a slight step back from back then. And I'll be back recently, at least, on Fantastic Four 49. All right, 3 books left, all DC related. First up is Captain Atom #1, first appearance of Captain Atom, Nathaniel Adam, and this had to do with James Gunn tweeted something, so people jumped on a book. This has happened a bunch since he took over kind of the DC movie universe. Raw copies back then were 5 to 15, so not a huge value, but 9.8 jumped up to 150 to 175, which was a big jump for this book. Now it's a $5 to $20 book on a raw side. 9.8, so still sitting 160, 180, so we're going to call this steady and worth it. Still a lot of interest here. People want to see what's going on, and this is held better than I would have expected for a late 80s book that's not super low print, but not a ton of 9.8s out there, which I think is keeping the value on this 9.8 pretty high. Next, we have Superman Man of Steel #18, first appearance of Doomsday. Are a lot of 9.8s of this out there. Raw copies 18 back then, 9.8, 110 to 115, and this had to do with Doomsday showing up in the Superman and Lois show, or being teased for that show, and yeah, Doomsday showed up in a bunch of different things. The books, there's so many of these that there's, not a ton of value here. Still a $5 to $15 book. 9.8, 1 to 120, but most of the sales are on that raw side, and those are definitely down, and I'll be back compared to what it was back then. And then our last book this week is Kingdom Come, #1, the alternate DC Universe story by Alex Ross back in the 90s. This was a huge deal back then. And basically, so this hit the list because the logo, the Superman logo that James Gunn is using for the Superman movie was similar to the logo Superman has in Kingdom Come. So people were thinking the connection, but really they were still only paying like $9 for this, but it seemed kind of a silly connection. It's still a $2 to $10 book. Just a lot of sales back then, so they didn't pay a whole lot. 9.8, 125 to 150, which is kind of where this book typically sets in a 9.8. So we're going to call this a down, and I'll be back. No reason to have gone and gotten it. You wouldn't have lost much money, but there was no reason to chase it. So that is this week's list. We did have quite a few steady books that stayed around that same value, about half the list, which is pretty unusual, but overall, pretty typical. Most of the books you either haven't lost any value if you waited to now to buy them, or you could have done better. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and we will catch you next time. Later.